Ada Branham did not begin the work the night she walked up the ridge to Harlan Craft's camp. She had already begun it. She had begun it the afternoon he rode in on his bay horse with his good saddle, and she had looked at him from the porch of the farmhouse and understood with the specific clarity that had been hers since childhood, and that her father called a gift and her mother called a burden, and that she called simply the way she saw what he had come to do. She had not needed the 3 days of his preliminary survey work to confirm it. She had not needed the conversation at the gate or the technical questions she had put to him to establish the depth of his knowledge and therefore the depth of his deliberateness. She had known when she saw him come through the gate what he was and what he intended and what it would produce. She had gone to his camp that night not to stop him. She had told him truly that she knew she could not stop him, but to begin. The telling was the first part. This was what her grandmother had taught her, and what her grandmother's grandmother had taught before that, the knowledge passed down in the specific way that certain knowledge passes in families that have learned to hold it carefully. Not written, not formalized, not performed in any way that the outside world would recognize as what it was. Told. Woman to woman, the older to the younger, the knowledge transferred in language the way a river transfers water, the same substance moving from one vessel to another, losing nothing essential in the passage. The telling was the first part, because the thing being worked required a witness, required that the one who had done the wrong hear plainly and without metaphor the nature of what they had initiated. Not a warning. She had been clear with herself about this distinction before she walked up the ridge. Not a warning, because a warning implied the possibility of turning back, and she did not believe Harlan Craft was a man who would turn back, and she did not want him to. She wanted him to hear and to understand and to proceed anyway, because proceeding anyway was what completed the first part. The debt required full knowledge on the part of the debtor. A man who did wrong in ignorance accumulated a different kind of debt than a man who did wrong in full understanding. Harlan Craft had full understanding. She had made certain of it. She walked back down the ridge in the dark, and she went home, and she began. What Ada Branham did over the following 36 years is not a thing that can be described with complete accuracy in the language available to the people who came after her, because the language available to the people who came after her was not designed to carry it. The approximations available are these. She worked. She tended. She maintained something that required tending and maintenance, the way a fire requires tending, the way a garden requires maintenance. Not dramatic intervention, but sustained, patient, daily attention to the conditions that allowed the thing to continue. She knew from what had been passed to her that what she was working with was not a quick thing. Quick things were for quick wrongs, an insult, a small theft, the ordinary injuries that people visited on each other in the course of ordinary living. What Harlan Craft had done was not a quick wrong. It was a structural wrong, a wrong that had taken years of planning and professional expertise to execute, and that would take years of legal consequence to unfold. A wrong that was woven into documents and courthouse records and the legal description of land that now read differently than it had read before he came. A structural wrong required a structural response. The ground collected structural debts differently, slowly, with the patience of the ground, which was the oldest patience there was. What she worked with was the land itself, the portion of it that remained theirs, the 206 acres that Harlan Craft's false lines had left them, the ground that her grandmother's grandmother had come to from wherever she had come from, and that held in its soil and its stone and the roots of its trees the accumulated presence of everyone who had lived on it and worked it and been buried in it. She worked with that presence. She worked with the connection between that presence and the specific wrong that had been done, the line she drew between the taking and the taker, the thread she maintained between the debt and the debtor across the years and miles between Wise County and Abingdon. She did this every day, in the morning before the farm work and in the evening after it, and on the days when the farm work was light, she did it longer. She did it in the specific way her grandmother had showed her, and in ways that the doing itself revealed to her over the years, because the work, sustained long enough, taught its own extensions. She did not speak of it, not to her brothers who had dispersed to the mines and to other counties, not to her father in the years before he died, not to anyone in the county who might have named what she was doing and thereby changed its quality by the naming. She kept it between herself and the ground, and the thread that ran from the ground to the man in Abingdon who had drawn false lines on a paper and called it true. She tended it for 36 years. Abingdon, Virginia, 1891. The first thing that happened to Harlan Craft after Wise County was not dramatic. He would not have attributed it to Wise County at all if he had thought about Wise County, which he did not. His survey practice continued. He had 3 good years after the Branham job. The coal money was moving fast through southwest Virginia, and there was work for a surveyor who could produce clean documents quickly and without complications. He did 2 more jobs of the same kind as the Branham job in 1888 and 1889, and in both cases the results were as he intended, and the families lost their land, and the coal money moved in, and Harlan Craft was paid and moved on. In 1891, he made an error. Not a fraudulent error, a genuine one. The kind that a careful and experienced surveyor should not make, a transposition in the field notes that produced an incorrect legal description, nothing to do with any deliberate manipulation, simply a number written wrong and not caught in review. The error was caught by the opposing party's surveyor in a routine boundary dispute that had nothing to do with the coal work, and the correction was made and the legal description was amended, and no lasting damage was done. But it was the first error Harlan Craft had made in 11 years of practice. He was bothered by it in the specific way that a precise man is bothered by imprecision, not with guilt, but with professional disturbance, the feeling of a mechanism that has produced an unexpected result. He reviewed his field notes from the previous 3 years and found nothing else. He attributed the error to fatigue, which was plausible, and he was more careful for the following 6 months. He made another error in 1892. Different job, different type of mistake, equally uncharacteristic. This one was not caught before the document was filed, and the correction required a court proceeding that cost his client money and cost Harlan Craft, the client, and a portion of his professional reputation in that county. He was angry about this in the way that men who do not examine their interiors are angry, at external causes, at the client's opposing counsel, at the clerk who had processed the document, at circumstances that were, in his assessment, arrayed against him through no fault of his own. He did not think about Wise County. Wise County, Virginia, 1895. Ada was 30 years old, and the work had been going for 8 years, and she could feel in the way she felt things that it had taken hold in the way that certain plantings take hold, not visible above the surface yet, but established in the roots, the essential structure of it sound and growing. She had felt the first error in 1891, not the specific nature of it. She did not see Harlan Craft's field notes or know the particulars of his professional life. What she felt was a loosening, a slight give in the tight professional competence that had been, when he came to this county, as close to impenetrable as a human quality could be. the confidence that had allowed him to ride in on his good horse and meet her father at the gate and look her in the eye and answer her technical questions and ride away and do the work he had come to do. That confidence had a structure to it, and the structure was beginning slowly to develop the kind of fault lines that structures develop when the ground beneath them is no longer entirely stable. She tended the work. Her father had died in 1901. She knew, in the way she knew things, that this would happen before it happened, and she had made what peace she could make with it. He died in the farmhouse he had been born in, on the land that remained theirs, and she buried him in the family ground alongside his father and his grandfather and the grandmother who had begun the line of transmission that had come to her. She buried him, and she grieved him, and she continued the work, because grief and work were not incompatible, and she had enough of both to sustain them simultaneously. Her brothers came for the burial and went away again. They did not understand what she was doing on the land, the daily patient tending. They understood that she was staying when they had left, and that the staying had a quality of intention to it that was different from simple stubbornness, and they did not ask about it, and she did not explain. The knowledge passed woman to woman, and she had no daughters, and she had not yet determined what this meant for the work after her. She had time. The work was not finished. Abingdon, Virginia, 1898. Harlan Craft's son was named William, and he was 19 years old in 1898, and he had come into the survey practice that year, having shown from childhood the same facility with numbers and spatial reasoning that had made his father good at the work. Harlan had trained him carefully and with more explicit intention than he brought to most things in his life. The practice was the thing he intended to leave behind him, the form his legacy would take, and William was the vessel for it. William was good, better than good. He had his father's technical precision and something additional, a natural ease with clients that Harlan had always had to work at. He would be an excellent surveyor. He made his first error in the 3rd month of the work. Harlan told himself it was inexperience. He told himself that all young surveyors made errors in the beginning, that the errors were part of the learning, that William would tighten up as he accumulated field experience. This was true as a general principle, and Harlan applied it specifically to his son without examining whether the specific errors William was making were consistent with inexperience or consistent with something else. They were not consistent with inexperience. Harlan knew this in the part of himself he did not examine. The errors William made were not the errors of a young surveyor learning his instrument and his methodology. They were the errors of a surveyor whose instrument was sound and whose methodology was correct, and who nonetheless kept producing results that did not match what the instrument and the methodology should have produced. As if something in the chain between observation and notation was introducing a distortion that no calibration could correct. William did not speak of it because he did not understand it. Harlan did not speak of it because he did not want to. Neither of them thought about Wise County.
Wise County, Virginia, 1905. Ada was 40 years old, and the work was 18 years along, and she was beginning to understand, with the clarity that the sustained practice of anything over a long period produces, the full shape of what she was doing. She had understood from the beginning that the debt was generational. Her grandmother had been explicit about this, the knowledge precise on the point. Blood theft went into the line, into the children and the children's children, because what was taken from a family went into that family's land, and the land held it, and transmitted it to the children who came after, and so the taking had to be answered at the same level, in the same terms, across the same span of time. You could not answer a generational wrong in a single generation. The accounting required the same depth as the injury. What she was understanding now, 18 years into the work, was the mechanism, not the general principle which she had known from the beginning, but the specific way it moved, the way the thread she maintained between the Branham ground and the Craft line transmitted not a single concentrated consequence, but a distributed one, a slow, pervasive loosening of the thing that had made Harlan Craft capable of the wrong he had done. His competence, his certainty, his professional precision, the impenetrable confidence of a man who believed that what he was doing was simply the way things worked, and therefore required no examination. That confidence had been the instrument of the wrong. The ground was taking it back, slowly, through the line, not destroying the Craft family, but dismantling, increment across the generations, the specific quality that had made the wrong possible. And as it dismantled it in the fathers, it transmitted the absence to the sons, because that was how lines worked, the inheritance of what the parents were. And the sons would transmit it to their children and their children's children until the line came back, as she had told Harlan Craft it would, to what had been taken. And when it came back, the ground would collect. She tended the work. She was 40 years old, and she had perhaps 20 years left if her health held, and 20 years was enough. She had been shown in the way things were shown to her that she did not need to complete the work herself. She needed to sustain it long enough for the work to sustain itself. A fire tended long enough became a fire that could sustain itself without tending. She was nearly there. Abingdon, Virginia, 1909. William Craft's son was born in 1909 and named James for no particular reason, in the way that names are sometimes chosen. William had married in 1903 and had 2 daughters before James and would have 1 daughter after, and James was the only son, the one who would inherit the practice, the one toward whom the accumulated professional aspiration of 2 generations of Craft surveyors was oriented. William had made his peace with his own erratic professional performance. He had told himself a story about it over 11 years of practice, a story about the particular challenges of Southwest Virginia surveying, about the difficulty of the terrain and the inconsistency of the clients, a story that did not require him to examine the errors themselves or their specific character. He told his wife on the night James was born that the boy would be a surveyor. His wife said, "What if he doesn't want to be?" William said, "It's in the blood." He meant this as a positive statement. He meant the facility with numbers, the spatial reasoning, the professional tradition. He meant the practice and the name and the accumulated expertise of his father and himself. He did not know what else was in the blood. Wise County, Virginia, 1914. Harlan Craft died in the spring of 1914 in Abingdon, in his own bed, of the ordinary causes of a man of 70 who had not attended carefully to his health. He died not thinking about Wise County. He died not thinking about Ada Branham, or the 412 acres, or the thread that had been running from that ground to his line for 27 years. Ada felt it when he died. Not grief. She had no grief for Harlan Craft. What she felt was a shift in the work, the way you feel a shift in a fire when a large piece of wood burns through and the structure of the fire changes. The work was not diminished by his death. It was, if anything, clarified. The debt did not die with the thief, as she had told him. It moved. It moved into the line. She was 49 years old, and she had been working for 27 years, and she had perhaps 9 years left, she thought. She had the sense which had been accurate about other things that she would die at 58, though she could not say how she knew this. 9 years was enough. The work had been established long enough, tended carefully enough that it would continue after her, not requiring the daily maintenance of the early years, not requiring her specific attention and the specific knowledge she carried, but continuing in the way that something set in motion continues, in the way that water set running finds its own way downhill without requiring anyone to direct it. She had done what her grandmother had told her could be done. She had sustained the work long enough for the work to sustain itself. The thread between the Branham ground and the Craft line was no longer something she maintained. It was something that existed, in the ground and in the line, with the permanence of a river valley carved by water over centuries. The water was gone, but the shape of what the water had cut remained, and any water that ran through that valley now would follow the shape the first water had cut. The Craft line would follow the shape she had cut for 27 years. They would come back to what had been taken. They always came back. Greed was a compass. When they came back, the ground would be waiting.
Wise County, Virginia, 1923. Ada Branham died in October, at the age of 58, on the land her family had held since before the county records went back far enough to document how long. She died in the farmhouse she had been born in the bed her father had died in, and she was buried in the family ground alongside her father, and his father before him, and the grandmother whose grandmother had come to this land from wherever she had come from, and made it hers. She had no children. The knowledge she carried, the specific woman-to-woman transmission that had come to her and through which she had worked for 36 years, ended with her in its explicit form. But the work itself did not end with her. She had made certain of that. The last thing she did, in the final weeks before she died, was walk the boundary of the family land. Not the full 412 acres, the 206 that remained, the portion Harlan Craft's false lines had left them. She walked it slowly in the October cold, and at each point where the false boundary cut through what should have been theirs, she stopped, and she did the last part of the work, the part she had been building toward for 36 years. She pressed her hands into the ground at each false boundary point. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. The work was past the point of requiring language. What she left in the ground at each of those points was what she had carried for 36 years, the full weight of the knowing, the specific quality of attention she had sustained, the accumulated record of what had been taken, and from whom, and by whom, and what had been laid against it. She pressed it into the ground the way you press a seed into soil. The ground received it the way ground receives a seed, with the patience and completeness of something that has been waiting. She walked back to the farmhouse and went inside and did not go out again. She died 9 days later in the night, without difficulty. The ground held what she had put in it. The Craft line continued in Abingdon, 3 generations deep now. William and James, who had been born in 1909, and the children James would have in time, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren that the line would produce in its ordinary human way. The compass of their inheritance pointed southwest toward the mountains and the coal fields and the land records of Wise County, where a survey filed in 1887 had produced a legal description that was technically immaculate and foundationally false. They would come back to it. Lines always came back to what was theirs, or what they believed was theirs, which in the case of the Craft line was the same thing. The ground knew this. The ground was patient. It waited.